like to shift a little bit from the world of pure scholarship or publishing of scholarship, because teaching is still scholarship.
Yes.
Just with a different audience in mind. And so after about a decade of having taught at Pomona, you came over to what we affectionately call the southern part of heaven.
Yes, it was a very interesting option. I had been thinking about the desirability of moving to a research university. There's not a very large number of places where Islamic studies was accommodated. And still, it's expanded somewhat since then, but not as much as it could in the U.S. But in any case, a position came open at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It was defined as Islam in South Asia. And I think in some respects it's a bad idea to limit fields too much, because then you have a very small number of applicants and your choices are not as good. But that's how they designed it, and so I presented some of the material on my long-standing study of yoga among Sufis. And so I eventually got the job, and Pomona College did not make any effort to retain me. They said, well, actually, we're not going to support your area. So they may have regretted that. In fact, I know that there was some criticism expressed of the administration. But at any rate, I joined the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, and I really came with the purpose of trying to build programs and to create collaborations and to develop Islamic studies as a field that would move across the disciplines. And I'm happy to say that in many respects this did turn out to be a successful project. And I owe many people thanks for their collaboration in this. And of course one of them is Bruce Lawrence. And he's my very dear friend, and we've taught together at least 7 or 8 times, and we wrote a book together. And we've done many projects together. We still work together on editing a series of publications from the University of North Carolina Press. And with Charlie Kurzman, who's an Iran specialist from our sociology department, he wrote a very important book on the Iranian Revolution. He and I have worked for the past 20 years on establishing a Middle East Center, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Center. And that's a tough project to do. I remember the dean at one point said, well, who appointed you guys to lead this project anyway? It was not something which emerged from the top ranks of the administration, but came from the faculty. But that's the right way to do it. And there was a series of collaborations that included people at Duke, such as the late John Richards, very fine historian, I miss him. And Tony Stewart at North Carolina State University, who's moved to Vanderbilt. He and I taught a NEH seminar together once. And then I later on did one by myself on the literature of Islamic mysticism. I just had a correspondence yesterday from one of the people who was in that seminar. It wasn't until about 2000 that I actually started to get graduate students. It takes a while to establish a program in graduate studies, in doctoral studies. But Bruce Lawrence and I and our dear friend Richard Martin, who passed away a couple of years ago, we got together in 1996. I was the chair of my department, and they were also chairing the departments at Duke and Emory. And we had a serious talk about Islamic studies. And I was trained at Harvard, Bruce at Yale, and Rich Martin at Princeton. And we said to ourselves, and we said as in a matter of agreement, those older universities had not succeeded in connecting Islamic studies to the field of religious studies. And you and I have talked about this repeatedly. And so we said, let's make that our project. And we embarked on a series of initiatives that included conferences and a publication series that started off our UNC Press series. And there were a lot of people who contributed to this. Ibrahim Musa when he was here. And so collaboration, is really essential to any effort of this kind. Then after 2000, we started to get high quality graduate students coming to UNC. I was frequently involved earlier with graduate committees at Duke. I've been on at least 12 PhD committees at Duke. And they, starting with you and Scott Kugel, right? And that was a great process. I was really glad that we had this intellectual community between the two universities, and so that worked very well. And ultimately, we ended up expanding this in the form of the Middle East Center that was funded by the U.S. State Department, Department of Education. And the first round of success on that was in 2010, which is 12 years ago. So that was really an important major step forward because it provided funds for graduate students to study languages and really made a big impact across the curriculum. But, we forgot to mention the Quran controversy of 2002.
Right.
One of the most interesting moments was when the University of North Carolina chose a book of selections from the Quran as its required reading for incoming students in the fall of 2002. This is 1 year after 9/11. And the committee that was entrusted with the decision on selecting the book was sort of paralyzed, and the committee chair had come to me. He was a poet from the English department, and he asked me if it would be possible to assign a reading of the Quran. And I said, there's only one way I think you could do this, and this is to take the very poetic translations of the surahs from the last juz of the Quran that Michael Sells did, and it was a fine piece of work. I said to myself, could this be controversial? No. And once again, I was a very bad prophet of political events. And the University of North Carolina was attacked on Fox News, subject to a lawsuit from Virginia, and threatened with the loss of funding from the state legislators. It was serious. And I'll never forget how many journalists were running all over the campuses, and it was hysterical. And one of the most profoundly important moments that I experienced as a faculty member was when we were doing the orientation for the 175 faculty and staff and administrators who were going to lead discussions with groups of 20 students so they could talk about this book. And, we gotten so many letters from people saying, well, why don't you just teach the Bible? I mean, they thought that when we teach something, we're advocating it. There's a serious misunderstanding of the mission of the university. But in any case, we were having this orientation, and the chancellor was taking part. He was going to lead a discussion section like everybody else. And someone asked him, what if we lose the lawsuit, which would have prevented us from having a discussion of the book? It's so ridiculous. I mean, making people read books is what we do.
Somehow related to our mission.
But the chancellor was asked, what do we do if we lose the lawsuit? And he said, we will appeal. But that didn't satisfy the questioner. He said, what if we lose the appeal? And then the chancellor, a musician, by the way, he said, if we lose the appeal, I will call a meeting of the entire university. And we will discuss academic freedom. That was a powerful moment. And it made me realize how important our job is. And that's when I probably started putting together the seeds for what became, the Islamophobia book didn't come about until sometime later, but when I was on the board of the Middle East Studies Association, I was asked to put together a panel on Islamophobia for the as a plenary session for the annual conference, and I chose the top people I could get. They all agreed. They all agreed to write the results as quickly as possible, and it was a fine volume. The introduction was an opportunity for me to go back over this whole problem and to see how deeply it was etched into American society. I had to say in the introduction that we were not going to discuss the deep involvement of the Republican Party and a number of other related subjects because it was too big, too many things going on. But it allowed me to make the case about the opportunistic, devious, and dishonest nature of the attacks on Islam in our society, and the importance of bringing this to consciousness. And so that was a really great moment in some ways, that Quran controversy. But then, as you asked about the graduate students, and so that's been one of our great subjects of pride for our department. We have an enviable record of placement in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, which still is around 90% in academic jobs. And you really can't get any better than that. And so I've been fortunate to deal with students who are really of high quality caliber as human beings and are contributing and leading in the national scholarly organizations. And so I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. And we've done so in a community of affection and with ethical commitment. And I think that's the way it should be done. So to all of my graduate students, I salute you.
You have a long line of people who take your example, not only as a scholar, not only as a teacher, but really as a human being to heart. And they're trying to respond to it the only way possible, which is to pass it forward. And that's all any of us can do. When do you know that one of your students is ready to leave the nest?
Well, it happens in different ways, and sometimes it happens in a way which has not been previewed. In other words, sometimes you get somebody who gets a job offer before we might have chosen to declare them to be ready, and then we do the best we can. But I think that the readiness is really part of the process. The way that we ask our students to put together their own exam reading list, there are still places around the world where there is a fixed curriculum of books that you will have to read for a particular degree. And that has been chosen by the faculty, and that's the way it is. And that kind of authoritarian canon, we do not find to be very helpful, because if you're not involved in the creation of the organization of knowledge, then your engagement is reduced considerably. And so by asking the students to define a series of 4 fields and to use the bibliography which they have read, some materials that they know, and then materials that they don't know that they should read, and stuff that we told them to read, a combination of that, they come out of that experience with a maturity that is enviable. And I think that sets them on the road to the dissertation in a very effective way. The dissertation, and you've heard me talk about this many times, I always maintain it's the answer to a question. So what is your question? That is the hardest part of the graduate program. But you have to be able to articulate that, and not at endless length. So that's when I tell them my uncle's advice. save your best ideas for later, in effect, but demonstrate your workmanlike accomplishment at the moment. But you don't have to be, as the other one we always say is, the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Mm.
The perfectionist never finishes. And so we want them to finish.
We do want them to finish. We do. A couple of the next questions I have are, you have this extraordinary vantage point to look back and look at where we are. And I'm not going to ask you to make prognoses about political matters, but about the institution that we've devoted so much of our life to, which is academia. It seems like in so many ways, the study of humanities in particular is, choose your metaphor, under assault or strained.
Right.
The focus of the university seems to be shifting towards science, technology, medicine, engineering, perhaps economics and political science. Certainly much less so religion, literature, music, philosophy, arts. How do you experience that as someone who has devoted so many decades of your life to study this?
Well, Omid, I've been, on a number of occasions in the last 10 or 15 years, I'm called upon to review departments of religious studies, and also some that were combined with philosophy. But I've reviewed some of the more important ones, including among the leading ones, Princeton, Santa Barbara. And I've seen that in many of these places they have had some erosion of their numbers. In other words, their enrollment numbers are not what they were in previous years. And I think that this is the result, quite clearly, of the last financial crisis, in which people, including parents, decided that it was important to get a usable career that can get them a job. And it was thought, and still is thought, that the humanities are a way to broke and poor and unable to get a job. And this is not accurate. I've just seen the figures from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on this, and it's really, the humanities, empirically speaking, are richly rewarding intellectually and not so richly rewarding monetarily, but there is a real living that can be made that is satisfying, and that's not going away. I think that there has to be some agility in responding to this kind of loss of confidence in the humanities, because if they seriously deteriorate, our society will suffer. It'll suffer from blindness, from ignorance, and all kinds of problems having to do with prejudice and so forth, on ways in which we haven't seen yet. And so some departments are making efforts to, my department was just offered a new position. We need to hire in religion and media and technology. This is a field that is going to have a lot of people interested in it. In the same way, you can have global focus, because in religious studies, you can easily, in a department of religious studies, have people dealing with more international subjects per pound of human being than any other department in the curriculum. And if by emphasizing excellent teaching, you can really, recently my department came out number 2 to computer science in terms of the interaction with students in the university. The deans love that. And so if you become too esoteric, and if you write in a style that nobody can read, you will become irrelevant. And I know that you care about reaching an audience. Some of our colleagues apparently don't. But I think that if scholarship is interesting and profound and has something important to say, it should be said clearly
Mm-hmm.
and without artifice and without excessive jargon. Because academics are looked upon as, if you say something is just academic, what does that mean? It means it's trivial, it's pedantic, and it's irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
So we can give a better face to the academic world, and that has to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be embracing the ethical challenges, and right now we're dealing with some of those very strongly in terms of particularly gender and race as issues that are deeply contested in our society.
Absolutely.
We have to contribute to that.
Absolutely. If you had a very bright undergraduate student who came to you and said, Dr. Ernst, I've taken your classes, I love it, I'm willing to work hard, I want to go to graduate school.
Well, I have to tell them to think about it, more than once, and also to look very seriously at the financial side of attending graduate school. Because to start off your career with a huge debt load is not going to be helpful to anyone. That being said, it's possible to gain scholarship support that if you work it with some planning and deliberation, I think it's possible to go through graduate school successfully. But you have to really feel like it is your vocation. It is something that you are called to do, that you feel is necessary for your fulfillment as an individual. It shouldn't be done for reasons that are extraneous. I mean, it shouldn't be done for show. It shouldn't be done because somebody else wants you to. And you need to understand something about how it works. So it's probably best to do a master's degree, if you can, and get a sense of it before making a decision. Because a doctoral study is long, and it can be lonely, which is why it's important to maintain a sense of community and support. And we're starting to see much more efforts placed on keeping people sane and that sort of thing. But a vigorous academic sector is really vital to the future of culture. But it has to be based on humility and willingness to communicate to the public without arrogance. That is something I would repeat again and again.
So I have 2 questions left.
Okay.
And these both bring us back in some ways to Persian and Iran.
Right.
There was a time where the study of Islam overwhelmingly focused on the study of Arabic.
Yes.
And then there was everything else. And you've developed your own scholarship in a way that you've crossed borders and languages and time periods. What would you want for an audience in Iran to know about the way that you see material in Persian as certainly forming the core of Iranian identity and contributions to humanity, but also not being restricted to modern Iran?
Well, I think that every nation has to struggle with excessive nationalism as a kind of mass form of ego. There is an appropriate way to relate with pride to one's culture, but there is also a kind of chauvinistic way of feeling that your culture is better than others. And so I think every people, every society needs to think about that. Iran has inherited a very rich tradition, but the boundaries of modern Iran do not define that tradition. It's much bigger than that. Persian, as we now know, was a major language of literacy from the Balkans to Bengal, both areas outside of modern Iran. And it was also used by a vast number of people who were not Muslims, including Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians. I recently did a paper on the Azarkevan group and their pure Persian texts, which are very unusual to read. There's not a single word of Arabic in there. But there were hundreds of thousands, if not more, of Hindus who were reading deeply in Persian poetry because they were the experts for the chanceries and secretaries of the governments of the kingdoms from the Mughals on down. And these people, some of them were incredibly learned and contributed vastly. I wish that my Iranian colleagues would become more interested in this because it would illustrate how powerful Persian is and how it took on a life that was bigger than strictly, one particular region. Maulana Rumi tells us, that I'm not from East or West, or the genius of Persian poetry is precisely in its universality and not in being restricted to the property of a particular group. So that type of thing is what made me feel a deep emotional impact when I visited the tomb of Sadi in Shiraz. And I will never forget that.
So, Carl, as we move towards wrapping up, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the friendships with people of Iran that have been meaningful to you over the years.
Well, I have been fortunate to become friends with a number of Iranians, scholars and non-scholars. In particular, Nasrallah Khorjavadi, who's been extremely supportive ever since I first met him in a conference in Europe. And Basim Kokai in Shiraz, who we have had a long relationship. The political events, nonetheless, have made these relationships difficult. And I received an invitation from Ferdowsi University in Mashhad several years ago to go for, just before the pandemic began. And it just seemed to me that the political situation was not good. And I was not able to do that. But every time I've been in Iran, I met really wonderful people, including one of my translators. I have a bigger Wikipedia page in Persian than I have in English. And my book on Ruzban Bakli has several editions, of reprints, which the English version is not. And the translator, Majid Kebani, very fine scholar, and I really appreciated getting to know him and others, calligraphers, publishers, and many others. So I feel I have a very important relationship there, which has been frustrated by the misfortunes of modern politics. As I say, I have, in some respects, more fans in Iran who understand what I'm doing than elsewhere. And I think they've been particularly interested in the approach that I have taken, which includes rhetorical criticism. And I see that some people have, I think, perhaps picked up on some things from my contributions. And that's very richly rewarding. So, not sure what's going to happen in the future. Things are still very complicated in all of our countries these days. But I sincerely hope that I can see some of these friends again and people that I've corresponded with but never had a chance to meet.
And that nature has its seasons. There's a time for spring and flourishing, and a time for summer and for autumn, and winter has its beauty as well, and scholarship has its own seasons as well, and so you're getting ready to cease from formal teaching at the university, though you'll continue, no doubt, in other capacities. What are you looking forward to in this next season of life and scholarship?
Well, I've been unexpectedly drawn into a project involving the study of enslaved Muslims in the Americas. And we have an example that is somebody who was in North Carolina in the early 1800s and wrote an autobiography and a number of other documents. And so I'm working with some groups that include the University of Maryland, where there is a very ambitious project which is simultaneously talking about optical character recognition of manuscripts so that we can actually start to make available some of these writings that are only available in manuscript so far. And I would also like to do this with some of my favorite Persian texts, because the old-fashioned way, I've seen the way that Omid Safi did a text. He would write out the Persian, and then at the bottom he had a very efficient way of putting the different manuscript readings. And then this was more or less copied in print. But it's very laborious, and I think that we can take advantage of the new technologies to improve on that. So there are some Sufi texts that I'm interested in Persian. I mentioned Muhammad Al, he's a kind of fascinating figure. And there are these texts by Hindu authors. I've edited one of these. It is a description of all of the different types of ascetics who lived in Benares in 1800. And it includes a defense of Vedanta philosophy, which is written entirely in the style of Ibn Sina vocabulary. And there were people who felt that, as in the Sha'ubiyya movement of the early caliphate, there were people who wanted to show they were superior to the Arabs by mastering Arabic. There were Hindus who wanted to do the same thing with Persian. And so I like that project because it actually works against the nationalisms that are so powerful both in India and in Iran. Because it talks about exchange between cultures rather than claiming a certain ownership over it. And so I think that would be a healthy thing for us to entertain. I also still am very fond of poetry, and I was thinking, I haven't read Attar for some time, but his Divan, if it hadn't been for Rumi, I think Attar would be much better known than he is as a lyrical poet.
It's a misfortune to show up a generation before possibly the greatest poet.
But Attar has some fantastic things, including, some long qasidas that are didactic, and there are other authors that I want to go back to. So I'll share those with you when I discover some gems, if you agree.
Oh, it would be a pleasure. Do you have any concluding words for our friends watching this?
I think what I've tried to do in my career is to demonstrate the possibility of a serious understanding of another culture without having to join, to be a friend. And I think that's something that we need more of in this disturbed world, to create an ethical community that is not defined by nationality, religion, or ethnicity. And I'm encouraged to find people who respond well to that. So I would like to suggest that we make that the goal more widely. And if you and our listeners would join me, I would be very happy.
You've got a lot of friends lining up next to you.
Thank you.
you.